Everybody's yelling broker transparency, but almost nobody's explaining what's actually happening right now. The FMCSA has an official rulemaking open on broker transparency under 949 CFR 371.3. And inside that process, advocacy groups have submitted draft language and policy proposals that go much further than the current rule. This is not enacted law. This is a live regulatory process. And depending on what gets adopted, it could reshape how freight brokerage actually works. So let's break this down carefully, okay? So, what is actually on the FMCSA's website? The FMCSA has issued a notice of proposed rulemaking. This is what we call a NPRM on broker transparency. That means the agency is considering changes to the Rule 49 CFR 371.3. This rulemaking was prompted by petitions from the Small Business and Transportation Coalition, it's head up by James Lamb, the Owner Operator Independent Drivers Association, we all know it as OIDA. Both groups have been advocating for stronger enforcement of broker transparency and a elimination of waiver practices. The NPRM is real, it's in the public record, and it's open for comment. Now, what we need to do is separate from the official NPRM text. There's a draft policy language and advocacy proposals that's being circulated and submitted into the docket that go a lot further. So that's what we're going to analyze today. Where we are today with 49 CFR 371.3, right now, underneath it, brokers must keep transaction records. Carriers have the right to review those records, but here's the issue. Most broker carrier contracts include waiver language. So when you sign the contract and you waive your rights to review those records, basically, transparency technically exists, but in practice, you're actually signing it away. Enforcement has also been limited. That's the current structure. Now, here's where the broader reform proposals would change. Now, before anybody says this isn't real, I want you to look at this, okay? It says 119th Congress, second session, HR blank. This is written full congressional bill format. You see the structure, you see the formatting, you see the be it enacted language, but you also see something else that's very important. There is no bill number, there is no named sponsor, there is no committee assignment. That means this is draft legislative language. It's not rumor, it's not a social media post, and this is not hearsay. Draft congressional format law. Read what it says this would do. It would revise property broker regulations. It would establish financial security requirements. It would create cause of action. It would prohibit certain business practices. It would establish a minimum freight rate. That's not a tweak. This is a structural rewrite. Now we're going to go through this page by page so you understand exactly what's being proposed. Okay, so this is where this section officially begins, okay? Section 1 is very simple. It just names the act, the transportation, the Intermediaries Accountability Act of 2026. That's just the formal title, all right? Now, Section 2 is where this starts getting really interesting. Section 2 is called Findings. This is where the authors lay out the justification. They frame this as a national transportation policy. They talk about promoting safe, adequate, economical, and efficient transportation. They reference reasonable rates. They reference preventing unreasonable restraint of trade. They reference fair competition. And they specifically reference oversight under 49 CFR 371. Now, let's slow this down. This section isn't changing law yet. What it's doing is it's setting the philosophy. It's building the argument that transparency and rate oversight fall within federal transportation policy. When you see language like reasonable rates and prevent unreasonable restraint of trade, that's not accidental. This is the legal groundwork for expanding oversight beyond just record keeping. This is the intellectual setup for the structural changes that come later. All right, this is still section 2. This is still the finding sections, but this page is where this gets really direct. Up top, it continues listing national transportation policy goals, things like efficiency, fair competition, reasonable rates, and stable consumer pricing. That's standard policy framing. But now, what I want you to do is look at paragraph 3. This paragraph says Congress has been made aware that some property brokers act as intermediaries, but in reality operate differently, and that some seek to guard the secrecy of their margins by evading existing broker transparency regulation under 49 CFR 371.3. Now, look, this is not neutral language anymore. This is an allegation. The findings section is asserting that some brokers have used waivers and contract structure to avoid transparency requirements. Now let's get on down to paragraph 4. This next paragraph references a 2020 petition filed by the Small Business and Transportation Coalition asking the U.S. DOT to stop brokers from coercing carriers into waiving their 49 CFR 371.3 rights. So this proposal is clearly tied to prior regulatory fights. Okay? You need to understand what this page is doing. This section doesn't change the law, it builds the case. It says, hey, there's a problem, there's evasion, there is coercion, there is an imbalance. And that narrative sets up the legal changes that follow. When you see strong language and findings, that tells you the authors aren't just tweaking policy, they are arguing systemic abuse. And systemic abuse is how you justify structural reform. Now, look at this, page 4. This is probably one of the most fascinating parts of this bill. They have been fighting all the way back to 2012, all the way back up to 2025. That is decades of regulatory fighting. This is not new. This has been petitions, counter petitions, agency decisions, public comment periods, agenda announcements for decades. I mean, just look at the timeline. This fight didn't start yesterday. We're talking about 2020 petitions, 2023 rulemaking grants, 2024 public notice, agenda announcements. This is 2026. This isn't social media outrage. This is organized policy warfare inside our federal regulatory system. Carrier groups petitioned. Broker association counter petitioned. The FMCSA ruled, then reopened rulemaking. This has been a back and forth for 2 decades. Now, this is page 5. This is the page that actually started making me really nervous. Up until now, we've been talking about transparency, disclosure, enforcement, but this page, this one changes the structure. I've been fine with everything up until this point. Right now, the federal broker bond requirement is $75,000 flat, okay? One size fits all. This proposal replaces that with a tiered bonding based on broker revenue. Now, I want you to read this clearly. Up to $750,000 revenue, $75,000 bond. $750,000 to $1 million, $100,000 bond. $1 million to $10 million, $1 million bond. $10 million to $100 million, $10 million bond. $100 million to $1 billion, $100 million bond. $1 billion to $10 billion, $1 billion bond. $10 billion to $100 billion, $10 billion bond. We went from 75,000 to 10 billion. Let me explain to you why this is where I got uncomfortable at. Because when you raise capital requirements like this, you don't just punish bad actors, you raise the barrier to entry. Small and mid sized brokers cannot survive extreme bonding requirements like this. Only the largest, most capitalized brokerages can. Think about that, the big ones. So when you raise the cost of staying in the game, the deepest pockets don't disappear, they dominate. And here's where this makes me cautious at. When markets consolidate, leverage concentrates. And when leverage concentrates, the smallest players usually don't gain power. The biggest players do. So while this page is framed as accountability, it also has the potential to lock in the largest freight brokers and push everyone else out. That doesn't automatically make it wrong, but this is the page where I stopped and said, this is where we need to think carefully about unintended consequences. Big brokers, big trucking companies. Page 6 finishes the findings and it moves into actual statutory changes. What it does is it lists unreasonable broker practices. And a lot of you have experienced this, offsetting cargo claims without authority, requiring extra inspections beyond federal rules to haul freight, refusing new carriers after short insurance lapses, refusing small carriers based on fleet size. This is what is considered framed as a restraint of trade. Now, here's where the real shift is. This page amends 49 U.S. Code 14906, evasion of regulation. This is powerful. What it does is it directs the secretary to enforce broker transparency under 49 CFR 371.3 in a non-discriminatory, non-arbitrary manner. This is not commentary. This is enforcement language. This page strengthens how transparency rules must be enforced. Up to now, we've seen bonding expansion. Now what we're seeing is enforcement tightening. This is where oversight becomes mandatory and not optional anymore. So this is page 7. What it does is it adds major statutory language. First, it tightens liability around cargo claims. It says brokers cannot manipulate shipment claims to offset freight charges improperly. That directly limits how claims can be used financially. Okay. Then it adds 49 U.S. Code 14917, unreasonable restraint of trade. It states it would be unlawful for brokers to require independent truckers or small carriers to undergo extra roadside inspections beyond federal requirements just to receive loads. It would also be unlawful to refuse new carriers solely because their authority is new or recently reinstated. And it's also unlawful to refuse small carriers simply because they have too few trucks in their fleet. That is direct operational restriction on how brokers can qualify carriers. This is important. Then it inserts language to establish a minimum truck transportation freight rate tied to the previous year's average cost to operate a truck per mile as published by the ATRI. That is not just transparency anymore. That is a proposed rate, that is a proposed rate floor framework. What this does is, or this page, it moves beyond disclosure and enforcement and into operational control and rate structure. Now, this is page 8, and this is where transparency becomes mandatory, and it's important because what it would do would be it would require brokers to disclose their commissions as a condition of keeping their registration. They must provide broker shipper financial documents showing what was paid, what was kept, and where the money went within 48 hours of delivery, and it cannot be waived by contract. You see, that's a big shift. Then it goes even further. If a broker fails to disclose, the secretary can compel disclosure and even move toward revoking the broker's registration. And here's the escalation. If commissions are determined to be not reasonable and customary, regulators could establish a zone of reasonableness for broker commissioners going forward. That's no longer just transparency. That's potential commission oversight backed by enforcement power. Now, this page adds teeth. Up until now, we've been talking about transparency and oversight. If you're still in there, hang in there with me. Page 9 turns that into lawsuits. It says failure to comply with disclosure requirements can constitute evasion of regulation. And it allows a person that's injured by noncompliance to bring a civil action. That means carriers could sue brokers over transparency violations. That changes behavior quickly. Because once civil liability enters a room, everything gets more serious. But here's the part nobody is really being honest about. There is not thousands of transportation litigation attorneys in this country. Freight law is very specialized. Broker carrier litigation is even more specialized. We know this firsthand because we already help lawyers with this type of litigation. I only know of 5 that I know of on one hand. If this opens the door to more lawsuits, one of two things is going to happen. Either the industry needs to train a lot more college kids about being transportation attorneys, or litigation becomes expensive very quickly. And when litigation becomes expensive, only the people with resources can sustain it. So yes, this page strengthens accountability, but it also raises the cost of conflict. Transparency backed by civil lawsuits is very powerful, but lawsuits are not cheap either. And when enforcement shifts from administrative oversight to courtroom battles, the legal system becomes part of the freight transaction. That's a serious structural shift. This is the final page, and this is where it all gets tied together. First, it amends federal code to make it explicit that brokers must comply with the transparency requirements laid out earlier. No ambiguity. Then it tightens the definition of what a broker is under federal law, making it clear that when brokers contract with carriers, they must comply with the minimum freight rate provision referenced earlier. That's important because that ties the rate floor concept directly into broker obligations. Then it orders a federal study. The Secretary of Transportation must report to Congress every 4 years on unreasonable restraint of trade and regulatory burdens in interstate commerce. And funding is authorized, $2 million to carry that out. So this isn't just a one-time change. It builds an ongoing oversight mechanism. Finally, it sets the effective date. So if this goes into effect, this change would take exactly 270 days after. So another year, guys, if not longer. That gives the market time to adjust, but make no mistakes, this page locks in the definitions. It ties brokers to minimum rate compliance. It institutionalizes oversight, and it sets the clock. This is where the proposal moves from theory to implementation. And what does all this mean? Now it's our turn to tell you what we think here at BRN. I'm going to be honest with all of you. After walking through all 10 pages, listening to the employees in this office, do I feel like this shifts power back to truck drivers? No, not really. There is parts of this proposal that I like. Making transparency non-waivable. That's great. Requiring disclosure within 48 hours. Okay, that's solid too. Accountability. Look, I understand that. But when I zoom out and I look at the structure, I don't see drivers gaining leverage. What I see is power being reorganized. I see bonding tiers that are favoring capital. I see expanded enforcement. I'm seeing civil litigation entering the picture, but I don't see drivers suddenly controlling freight contracts or capital. Transparency is visibility. Leverage is control. And those are not the same thing. SBTC and OIDA have clearly been involved pushing this framework. And look, I'm not attacking anyone, but I'm asking the only question that matters in freight. Who actually gains negotiating power if this gets passed? Because when regulation gets heavier, the biggest players usually adapt the fastest. The smallest players usually absorb the friction. We don't need more tape. Drivers don't need more problems. Drivers need real negotiating strength. Look at this timeline. 2012 all the way up to 2026 petitions, rulemaking, public notices. I don't know. If this has taken over a decade of regulatory fighting, this really tells you how much power is at stake. And I'll say this plainly. Too many drivers have lost everything in that time. Way too many. And so this isn't about being pro broker or anti broker. Right now, for me, it's about structure. Freight is leverage, freight is capital, freight is a lot of power. And until drivers have actual leverage in the transaction, shifting paperwork doesn't fix the imbalance. Transparency without leverage doesn't change who controls the deal. If drivers still don't control the freight, the contract, or the capital, then the power didn't move. It just shifted seats at the same table. And this is our honest analysis.